Bienvenue, welcome. Mon nom est Erwin Cutler. Je suis député de Montréal, a member of parliament from Mount Royal, and I'm accompanied here today by my fellow parliamentarians, co-chair James Bazan from the Conservative Party, Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party, and our second guest has just appropriately, dutifully arrived. No problem. We know what security is like, so I was going to waste a little more time just to make sure we could accommodate. Delighted to welcome you to the closing day of Iran Accountability Week, which was launched by an all-party group of parliamentarians a week ago today to effectively sound the alarm on the massive domestic repression in Iran. And it has included witness testimony before our Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on International Human Rights, and our guest today will be testifying before that committee at 1 p.m. Public forum with former Iranian political prisoners, a take note debate where, again, parliamentarians from all parties this past Tuesday evening engaged in a 4-hour discussion of the Iranian fourfold threat: nuclear, terrorist, incitement, and in particular, and that was the focus on human rights violations in Iran, and one of the centerpieces of Iran Accountability Week, which has been our Iranian political prisoner global advocacy project, where members of parliament have adopted, as it were, an Iranian political prisoner and advocated on their behalf so that they know that we stand in solidarity with them, that they are not alone, and that we will not relent in our advocacy until their release is secured. This Iran Accountability Week could not have taken place at a more propitious time, because as the P5+1 nuclear negotiations with Iran proceed, they have effectively overshadowed, if not sanitized, this massive domestic repression. We have seen an execution binge that has been almost unprecedented in the last 12 years, even by Iran's cruel standards, a criminalization of dissent, the imprisonment of political prisoners, and just 2 days ago we learned again of an important human rights advocate, Narj Mohammadi, the reformist advocate who had been advocating on behalf of the abolition of capital punishment, who was arrested, and the continued prosecution and persecution of the Baha'i. I can go on, but fortunately we have two leading experts with us today. Our first, and I'll begin with Dr. Ahmed Shaheed. He's the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran, one of the world's leading authorities on the situation of human rights in Iran. His mandate was recently renewed to the acclaim of all internationally. His regular reports inform us all wherever we are on the situation. He will speak first, and then he will be joined afterwards by Maziar Bahari, himself an Iranian-Canadian journalist and filmmaker, a former political prisoner whose films have also, compellingly brought the case and cause of human rights in Iran to the international forefront. So we'll begin with Dr. Ahmed Shaheed.
Thank you, Professor Cutler. Members of the press, honorable MPs, and my fellow guest, Maziar Bahari, a very good morning to you. Speaking about Iran is not a pleasurable subject because I have so much bad news to deliver frequently. But nevertheless, I will speak today. It's a pleasure to be here with you. As Iran and its colleagues in the international community continue to pursue what I believe to be good faith efforts to jointly address long-standing security and other challenges, we must also continue to maintain, I believe, a very sharp focus on addressing the conditions that continue to challenge Iranian government's ability to achieve its human rights obligations. And these are very, very serious challenges in that regard. As you heard, I shall be I'm happy and privileged to brief the subcommittee this afternoon on what's happening in Iran with regard to human rights. My report to the UN came out in March this year, and I reported at the time that the situation remains very dire. I remain more alarmed as time have as time have hope you well.
Maybe it's an Iranian conspiracy.
As time has progressed since that time, there's been more reason to be concerned about Iran. 5 years ago, government of Iran pledged to implement over 126 recommendations that came out of the UN membership at its UPR review. 6 weeks ago, Iran was again reviewed by the same council, the same membership, and Iran again accepted a second round of recommendations from that body. We found that what they agreed to do 5 years ago really wasn't done to a great deal, and we hope that we now have a chance to work further with Iran to make sure that these recommendations are now implemented in the time to come. And I do believe that more can be done to ensure that we hold Iran to its word on these recommendations. Iran continues to execute people to a higher per capita ratio than anybody else in the world. And as you heard from Professor Cutler moments ago, the past 6 weeks, the past few months, there's been an unprecedented spike in the rate of executions. Over the past few weeks, it's been about 6 a day on average. That's a very, very, very high figure. And I am concerned not just by the very high number of executions, but also the range of offenses for which people are put to death. A large number are for drug offenses which don't qualify under international law for capital crimes, capital punishment, as with other offenses such as corruption, sexual offenses, and increasingly political offenses as well. And a growing number of juvenile executions is also a matter of serious concern to me. And in addition to executions, Iran continues to harass opposition members, dissidents, as they have in the past. As you heard, even after President Rouhani promised to release dissidents, some were in fact released. But we just heard that Narges Mohammadi is again being detained, and I don't even know the pretext for which it's been done. So there's concern to be raised in that regard as well. And of course, Iran maintains it doesn't persecute political dissidents, doesn't persecute journalists, doesn't persecute lawyers. It maintains that they are not detained for the work they do as professionals, but for other activities, often defined as national security crimes, under laws which are so vague and so widely phrased that any action, including talking to me, could be seen as a national security crime or propaganda against the state. So clearly, Iran's legal system is being manipulated to the advantage of the authorities to undermine any scope for peaceful expression of views by the public. Iran's press law, as you well know, have 17 impermissible types of content, including insulting leaders and offending the supreme leader. So clearly, this has resulted in a very large number of journalists being in prison, about 40 at the present time, and this number has remained stable over a long time. Although people have changed as time have passed. And I'm concerned by a set of new laws that are being processed through the parliamentary process, including those that would further limit the space for NGOs, for political parties, and also for lawyers, granting the government powers over all three types of bodies and activists or professionals. I have always been concerned about Iran's treatment of ethnic minority groups and religious minority groups. The Baha'i fare the worst. Their top leadership remain in prison. Under the legal framework, Baha'i are almost non-persons in the country, and other laws allow authorities to identify people of different faiths and deny them certain access to basic services. So we find discrimination against the Christian minorities, the Sunni Muslims, in addition to the Baha'is and other minority religious communities there. Now, in my engagement with Iran, now in the 5th year now, I have always advocated the hand of friendship towards Iran if they are willing to work with me, because obviously there is cooperation is an important element of encouraging governments to progress towards better human rights conduct. However, Iran remains reluctant, or I should say Iran refuses to engage with me, if it's a proper word here, because they are required by UN's rules to give me access to the country, to visit the country, to enable me to meet people who have grievances, to meet officials who can explain the sources of these grievances and what government is doing with them, and to visit prisons and see what conditions are. But they have denied me this opportunity for 5 years running, and I think that in itself says a lot about what their intentions are. Having said that, I still remain committed to the task of monitoring on Iran's human rights conduct, and also supporting the government should they desire seek my support in moving that direction. I shall restrain myself here now and let you hear from the very eloquent Mazir Bahari and others who may be speaking after me today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shaheed. Thank you, Mr. Kotler, and thanks all friends for being here, and thank you for being here. I was arrested in June 2009. I was in prison for 118 days, 107 days in solitary confinement. I went through physical and psychological torture, but I'm not here to talk about my case now. Before coming here, I consulted with some friends in Iran and outside of Iran who've been through similar ordeal as me, some of them through even worse physical and psychological tortures that I suffered. And I would like to tell you a little bit about what many journalists, mostly unnamed, unknown journalists around Iran are going through on a regular basis. Unfortunately, many of them are not known outside of Iran. Many of them have very difficult names to pronounce. I'm really lucky that some people know how to pronounce my name. Thank you. But what I think really, maybe I'm not sure what word I can use, what really repulsed many of my friends in Iran was the statement by Foreign Minister Zarif in an interview with Charlie Rose last week, saying that no one is jailed for his opinion or for her opinion. He didn't say her, but yeah, but he meant that people are not jailed for their opinions in Iran, which is a lie. It is technically a lie, and it is a lie that is repeated by different members of the Iranian government. People say that Dr. Zarif responded to a question specifically by Jason Rezaian, our friend, a dual national who's been in prison. So by dissecting what Jason is going through, I would like to somehow maybe clarify what other journalists in Iran are going through now. It's been almost a year. He was arrested last June, in June 2014, and he's been in jail for almost a year now. We have not heard the Iranian government officially announcing what are the charges for his arrest. We have heard rumors about it. We have heard different MPs talking about it. We have heard his lawyer talking to a news agency very close to the Revolutionary Guards, talking about different charges against Jason, that he is most probably going to be accused of economic espionage. I, as someone who went through the same thing, can testify that the charges will be most probably bogus. The charges will have to do with what is regarded as a normal job of a journalist. They say that he was looking into companies that help Iran to circumvent sanctions. That is something that investigative journalists do all around the world. There is no difference between a dual national who is doing it in Iran and the rest of the world. The other thing that we have to know about Jason, and we have certain information about that, is that he's been forced to confess to his crimes. And most probably he was forced to confess a taped confession for working with different agencies and calling the Western media as part of the Western intelligence apparatus, that the Western world is using all its effort to undermine the Holy Islamic Republic. Again, I went through the same thing. I was forced to confess against certain members of the Iranian government. And when I rejected to refuse against those people, those individuals, and just talked about general ideas, general conspiracies that they fed me, I was punished again after my confession, and I spent more time in prison after my confession. And I'm not sure exactly what Jason has confessed to, but hopefully we will never see it, because from my experience, I can tell you that going through confession is like being raped. But the difference between confession and being raped is that it is a rape that is televised and then put on YouTube. So I hope that we never see Jason's confession. The other thing that we have to know about Jason's case is that his judge is a recognized human rights violator. Judge Abul Qasim Salavati has been sanctioned for human rights violations by the European Union. He was the judge of my case as well, and he sentenced me in absentia to 13 and a half years imprisonment. And if you wonder what was that half year about, it was for someone tagging a picture of former President Ahmadinejad kissing a boy on my Facebook page. I did not put that picture on my Facebook page. Someone tagged it. So the judge deemed that by having that picture, I meant that the president is a homosexual. Hence, I had to suffer 6 months imprisonment. And he also sentenced someone to execution because that person said that the myth of the Jonah and the whale is just a myth. It's not true. And he was executed as a heretic. So in my testimony this afternoon, I'm going to elaborate more on these subjects, and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions about our campaigns to help Iranian journalists. We have a campaign called Education is Not a Crime, which is for the Baha'i minority. We have a campaign called Journalism is Not a Crime. Unfortunately, the Iranian government has been providing us with a lot of material, so we are doing a lot of is not a crime. The last one is being a dog is not a crime, because of the way that they are killing stray dogs in the streets of Iran, and the parliamentary plan by some members of the Iranian parliament to ban pet ownership in Iran. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Yeah. So good questions are there, Dr. Shaheed, Maziar, both, and we'll be happy to entertain any questions.
I have a question for both of you. Professor Kotler talked about how the nuclear negotiations are overshadowing or maybe sanitizing Iran's human rights violations. I'm wondering what effect, if any, you think a deal or even negotiations towards a deal has had or might have on the human rights situation inside Iran.
Go ahead.
Okay. It is difficult to directly correlate what's happening in Iran with any particular factor, but certainly many are concerned that, a better sort of like image politically outside the country might give it license to behave differently at home. So that is a concern people have. At the same time, one must also recognize that should there be a lifting of sanctions in the country, there would be by itself positive developments in relation to the economic situation, possibly linked to that. But by and large, the concern one has is that by shifting focus away from the government's, if you like, bad behavior towards positive elements, then the issue of awareness of what's happening in the country on human rights, that becomes a concern. So one has to be very careful, I think, and look at what the government is doing. And one other element would be how the authorities in the country, how the supreme leader reads the final agreement that comes through. Is it a success, or does it want to paint President Rouhani as someone who's achieved a victory, or does he do it differently? all of which could have implications for that. But by and large, the concern I hear from Iranians is that because there's more focus on something other than human rights are getting neglected, and therefore government has more space, as it were, to behave in a very, very, if you like, egregious manner.
We have to understand that the victims of human rights violations in Iran, they are not only violated by certain members of the security branches in Iran, but they're also the victims of infighting within different groups. For example, I will talk about the Baha'is and the journalists. So the Baha'is and journalists, they are regularly brutalized by different parts of the Iranian government. But when there is an intense battle between different factions within the Iranian government, as we have witnessed since 2013 with the election of President Rouhani, the pressure on these groups intensifies because the conservatives who run the courts and the security forces in Iran, they know that they can tarnish the image of the executive branch outside of Iran by public execution, by shutting down newspapers, by incarcerating Baha'is, by killing the Baha'is. So as a result, I think the situation of the human rights in Iran has somehow worsened since the start of the successful negotiations. But I think we also have to be very careful not to mix these two things. I think they have to be two separate issues, the nuclear negotiations and the human rights situation. Otherwise, we're going to fall into the trap made by the Iranian government that they want to have a major bargain, that the West accepts a nuclear deal, and then as a result, they think that they're going to treat Iran like China or North Korea, that they're not going to talk about human rights abuses and human rights violations in Iran.
Do you put any thought in the argument that a successful deal would empower more comparatively moderate elements within Iran's power structure? Do you think there's any validity to that?
I think any opening in Iran, any kind of communications between ordinary Iranians and the rest of the world, Iran and the rest of the world, benefits moderate Iranians and ordinary Iranians. For example, if you think about the internet, the Great Wall, the firewall that, this national internet that they want to create, they cannot really do it successfully if Iran has any kind of banking relations with the rest of the world, like they cannot do it successfully in China. But they can do it successfully if Iran goes the way of North Korea and has no banking relations with the rest of the world. So I think any kind of negotiations, any kind of deal, it will help the moderate Iranians. But at the same time, we have to be careful as human rights activists, as members of the press. We have to be careful that the Western governments, the certain officials within Western governments, do not forget about human rights abuses because Iran is behaving itself in terms of its nuclear program.
Just to add to that, in terms of the space moderates have to make an impact, that's been closed down very rapidly. Of course, if one assumes President Rouhani is a moderate, then one has to look at the power structure in the country where the government actually is in a very weak position. The parliament is very conservative and very powerful compared to the government. The judiciary is very, very conservative and all powerful. And therefore, there is not much even he could do if he wanted to even. And then we have new laws in place, the bills on NGOs, the bills on political parties, all of that will shut down the space, even which exists present time, for moderates to make a difference should there be more easing of interaction between Iran and the rest of the world.
But at the same time, I need to add that the more embargo and more sanctions against Iran, more isolation of Iran is going to hurt even those little activities that the moderates have at the moment.
Okay, I want to thank you all for coming. Our two witnesses will be appearing before our Foreign Affairs Subcommittee International Human Rights between 1 and 2 p.m. just upstairs in room 237, I believe. And those of you will have an opportunity who can to hear further testimony. Again, thank you for coming and for being with us. And I want a special thanks and appreciation to both our witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.